the first slide, and then I'm gonna be really quick. Crystal? Okay, it's 12:01, and I just want to formally open this session. So this is the cross-cutting workshop. It is the fourth of a series of workshops that the National Academies organized at the request of the National Science Foundation. Crystal, can you show the slide? Okay, so details on all the events like bios, agendas are posted on the project website. And if you have any questions for us, please contact Crystal Saunders. Her email is on the screen. Also, I just want to say that this workshop will be recorded and materials presented on the slides, verbal comments, and comments submitted via Slido may be used in the workshop proceedings with attribution. Next slide, please. Okay, so on behalf of the planning committee, I just want to say thanks to everybody, moderators, discussants, PIs who participated in all the 3 previous workshops and the ones who are here today. We are so happy to have you. I just want to say thank you. Looking forward to an interesting discussion. And now I turn it over to the moderators.
You're on mute, Junie.
Steve, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I'll take it from there.
Sure. So I'm Steve Fiore with the University of Central Florida, professor of cognitive science, and I'll be facilitating with Jeannie today with a particular emphasis on discussion around knowledge integration and how that emerges from collaborative science.
Thank you. And I'm Jeannie Garbarino. I'm the Executive Director of Rocky View Science Outreach, which is the centralized science outreach program of Rockefeller University. And my role has been how to connect scientists and community members through the process of science in a way that is related to societies, and how to think about translating all of that to educational programming. So we're really excited to be able to, take the experiences that we have in our fields and come here and discuss all of this with these amazing discussants. So thank you to all the discussants for being here. Next slide, please. And so this is our agenda. We are looking to take some time to just go over some of the program information and the workshop goals. And then we're going to spend the majority of our work having an interactive discussion on the roles of life, the multidisciplinary research efforts, how education and training can fit in to support the convergence of scientific disciplines across research spectrums, and also the broader impacts. We'll also be opening up the forum for questions from those of you who are tuning in through the webcast. And we will do our best as moderators to remain focused on the goals. And if there are some really interesting comments that could take us down a rabbit hole but should be explored, let's put a pin in that. And we'll make some time at the end, if possible, to bring that back up, or maybe set a later time to discuss that. And at 3 o'clock, we will adjourn. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the URL program. So in 2016, NSF released their 10 big ideas for long-term research and innovation. And the UROL initiative, or Understanding the Rules of Life initiative, aims to unveil the predictable patterns across the time and scale of life. Next slide, please. So just as the understanding of the rule of life projects span across many dimensions and scientific disciplines, the planning and execution of the UROL projects too spans many dimensions. As such, in addition to uncovering the generalizable rules that we can apply to life, This program can also help us enhance our own capacity for engaging in complex scientific thinking and scientific experimentation. It can help us develop a training pipeline that sets multidisciplinary science as a norm for incoming scientists in the next generation of the scientific workforce. And to understand the layers of organization, communication, mentorship, education that ultimately promotes convergent research to take place. Next slide, please. All right, to date, there have been 6 funding cycles associated with the rules of life, and the numbers for these have been pretty impressive. Next slide, please. So this money has been distributed to 79 unique institutions for a total of $86 million. And of those 79 institutions, 6 are MSIs, or minority serving institutions. Within these institutions, there are 35 different states represented by PIs and co-PIs. And these research groups have started over 60 projects that aim to unveil some biological phenomena in 63 biological systems. So that's really amazing and impressive. And I think it speaks to the just moonshot nature of this awesome funding opportunity. Okay, next slide, please. And this is just a showcase of the diversity of the different institutions and PIs who were represented across the United States. So it's pretty well distributed. Next slide, please. Additionally, we saw that there were an amazing array of scientific disciplines coming together, spanning from physics, epigenetics, engineering, microbiology, to social sciences, the history of science, computer science, and math. And I think that this approach is really, in my personal opinion, just really fantastic. And the outputs of these collaborations have spanned across the fields of epigenetics, synthetic biology, microbiome understandings, and emergent networks. Next slide, please. All right, so last but not least, the workshop goals. Essentially, what we're really trying to figure out is how and to what extent does disciplinary convergence advance scientific research? We're also looking to understand what approaches groups might have used to support this cross-disciplinary research. What kinds of systems level approaches were they using? And even just management kinds of approaches were they using? How did the future societal needs piece integrate into their thought processes? Was there a bidirectional relationship between this, or was it more of just sort of trying to figure it out as you go? And then we'd love to sort of dive a little bit more into, are there currently ways that you can generalize the rules of life? And if not, what are some of the challenges that you might experience as you move forward? Okay, next slide, please. And finally, expectations. What we're really looking to do is have a frank discussion on scientific advancements and rules of life. Again, the multidisciplinary sort of convergent research ideas and how that integrates with education and training. And the societal needs and the issues around the scientific questions that might be asked, and then also any improvements for the future iterations of the Understanding the Rules of Life program. Last slide for me, the next slide, is about how you as a audience member of the webcast can submit a question. So we are using the platform Slido. So all you need to do is, I think this is a web-based platform, so you just go to Slido online and type your name and affiliation box under this webcast and click join event. So would that be because there's a link to the webcast and then there's a link under that webcast for Slido? Okay, great. Thank you. We are definitely using a different platform than the webcaster, so I just wanted to double check. All right, that is the last slide for me. Steve, go ahead and take it away for the next slide.
Okay. So the way we're going to do this is go through a set of kind of bigger topics and some of the themes that were identified from the surveys that people filled out. We had about 7 people respond to a set of questions that we had put together. And we're going to be organizing our discussion around the themes that we've identified. But first, one thing to point out here is when you look at the questions and how people think about the research that they're pursuing, we ask them specifically whether they characterize their work in the rules of life, where they characterize their work somewhere along this continuum of basic to applied research. And we had one more responded after this graphic was made, and that was another synthetic biology person, and they also put themselves down at the far left on item 1. And this is, we could spend the entire 3 hours talking about just this slide. I mean, this is a significant challenge. This is a significant issue that people in the US have been wrestling with for a number of years now. And it's fascinating. And those of you who are familiar with science and technology studies or science policy, you know what's been going on. And the challenge here is that the National Science Foundation and the way the federal government has thought about research was really codified back in 1945 with Science, the Endless Frontier, a white paper written by Vannevar Bush. He put that out at the request of Roosevelt. If you're not familiar with this history here, just briefly, Vannevar Bush was wartime science advisor, science lead, and Roosevelt realized that science helped win the war. And President Roosevelt wanted to see the federal government continuation of funding of science, and he tapped Vannevar Bush to come up with a plan. He wrote this white paper. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's available on the NSF website. In that white paper, though, he codified what we perceive in the United States as a continuum of basic to applied research. And that has had a tremendous influence on how those of us who grew up in the US and the way we think about science. But I'm contextualizing it this way because this is essentially a United States, an idiosyncratic view that comes out of the way we think about science. Other nations around the world did not necessarily consider science this way. And there was an important publication that came out called Pasteur's Quadrant back in 1997. It was written by Don Stokes, and he coined the phrase use-inspired basic science. And what Don Stokes argued is that the Vannevar Bush model of science as a continuum is misguided. He said science really isn't a continuum. We shouldn't think of it as this basic to applied. And he points out that when you look at the history of science, it really is more of an interaction between basic and applied research. And this is important to recognize because a number of other countries have always thought this way. For example, a number of European countries, they refer to transdisciplinary research, which is essentially a focus on the kind of interdisciplinary research you're all doing, but with an attention to real world problems. But more importantly, the National Science Foundation and the National Academies put out their convergence report back in 2014. And that convergence report was really an attempt to move away from thinking about science as this continuum. And I'm giving this bit of history, and I'm sorry if it's redundant for a number of you, but I wanted to put that in context because we've got a number of you who are being funded from this program. You're trying to explore the rules of life. You're trying to do this from an interdisciplinary standpoint, but we still see a number of people identifying along this continuum. So with that ramble of a preamble, I thought maybe we could just get some responses from people and just let us know how they thought about this question. That is, did you respond the way you did because you were forced to? Or do you not really think about your work somewhere along a continuum? Do you already consider your work as use-inspired science? Something along those lines. And Jeannie, if there's anything you want to add to that before, well, as people collect their thoughts.
Nope, I think that I'm good. So we can take a second to absorb some of that. And if you want to jump in and ask the first question.
Okay.
Holly, I see that your hand is raised.
I think that it's an interesting history and an interesting continuum that is often, as you say, because of the facets of NSF funding, hard to set out in your mind with something that you want to do that's cross-cutting in that way. But I think for our particular group, because we had both the basic biology and science questions in a system and setting that has a lot of applied restoration pressures currently, I think it was much easier for us to come at those simultaneously, because there's that consistent conversation within the field and within the public of what can we do at the applied level while we focus on these basic biological knowledge building exercises.
Thank you. Tina.
Yes, thank you. And I really appreciate the history that you gave. I think whether you're doing applied or basic research depends on where you sit in a way, right? I was attending a workshop with graph theorists, and this person was talking about very applied, very abstract math. And somebody asked, is there an application for this? And the guy is like, yeah, I have a killer application for it. Suppose you have a sequence of random graphs where every graph is infinite but locally bounded. And so that is not an application, that, for example, you can go to Silicon Valley and sell. You see what I mean? And so it's basically, at least I'm a professor in academia, whether you're doing basic or applied research depends on where you're publishing, which is, I guess, that history that accompanies this, right, that you just talked about. In terms of the use-inspired research, I like the idea. However, it seems like, a lot of it, then it's like, oh, we need this, so go and do research here. Versus a lot of the advances that put America on the forefront was not use-based, right? I would imagine that all the uses of like lasers now, we didn't know that then. So that's my 2 cents. I'll pass it on.
Okay,
Thanks.
well, before we go to Zach, I want to follow up on some of Tina's points. It's on the one hand, you've got different perceptions of what it means to do basic or applied research, and I think that's an important distinction. But the other is the pressures that come from academia, where you're going to publish. So I'm curious, has that changed any of the way you think about your particular projects? Because in looking at the responses, a subset of you said that you identified articles that you envisioned your teams writing, and along with those, I would imagine you identify potential outlets for it. So I'm curious, given this external pressure about where you can publish, did that change the way you conceptualize any of the research that you would be doing?
Not for me. I'm a full professor, so it doesn't really matter where I publish, right? I'm in a way 11 on my guitar. So, for my students, then indeed it matters. And for the postdocs, it does matter, in particular when they're coming up to then get jobs. And I'm a computer scientist. I work in machine learning. There are certain venues that my students have to publish if they want machine learning, data science, data mining jobs. And so I see that as part of my job as an advisor to break up the research and say, okay, this will go to this conference, this will go to this journal. And so that's just something we do. I'm sure all of us do that.
Mm-hmm. Comments from anyone else in this area of where you need to publish or are supposed to publish based upon academic pressures, and how that may have altered the way you think about the problems you're pursuing with the rules of life? No? Okay, you can make debate on that. Go ahead, Zach.
I'll start by just echoing others' appreciation for that history there that you shared, Stephen. That was super interesting and new to me. And what I wanted to add here is I appreciated the question here, as simple as it was, because going into our rules of life, even proposal writing, I would say, thought of it totally in the basic end of the spectrum. And when thinking it through, I was curious more about how we we define applied research. In like I come from a soil microbiology background, so I think of, how does the destruction of land influence carbon cycling, let's say, as an example of a highly applied work. But then, in that trying to elucidate these generalizable rules of life, I'm curious what others think, but I think it could also be considered applied in that trying to increase an appreciation of the complexity of communities and ecosystems to potentially combat, like as society becomes more urbanized, this concept of nature deficit disorder and a potential loss of appreciation of the natural world due to just less of an exposure to it. And so I'm curious what folks think about what I think as a redefinition of applied to more solve a issue with knowledge or the loss of knowledge versus more of an environmental application.
I think that's open to the floor for anyone. Okay.
I see your thumbs up, Joe. I appreciate that.
Yes. Keith, were you going to address that, or did you have an additional item?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm dovetailing off of that, where I put myself on that spectrum, where I put myself 5 or 6 years ago when I was a professor in academia, would have been very much on the basic side of that scale, and where I put myself now is about a 4, kind of on the other side. But what I do is really no different. I think what's been different is my location and the amount that I'm dealing with companies and understanding that there are applications for what I'm doing and fitting those into commercializable applications. I think in my field, and I'm a plant biologist, I'm not going to be able to commercialize anything and generate a product without a company. So I, at the university, I didn't really interact with the companies, and now I do, and I see all sorts of uses. So now I see myself as much more applied than I originally did. But again, there's nothing different than what I do. It's just this realization of the problems that these companies are having and how my technology or expertise can be used to solve those.
Okay, yeah, I think, again, we see the slipperiness of this definitional distinction of what it means to do applied research. And it seems that a number of you have the perception that to do something applied means to make a product. And I think the way others may think about it, particularly when I collaborate with folks in Europe, it's essentially thinking about a real world problem. And thinking about a real world problem and trying to identify how do you address, understand, and solve that problem. And that, to some people in the US, would be considered applied research, but the reality is to solve some of these real world problems, you have to come up with fundamental knowledge. You have to come up with a fundamental understanding of a set of issues that may be related to that. And those of you familiar with the history and philosophy of science will recognize these different definitions that will be emerging based upon where you're coming from in research. So I think we need to keep that in mind. But I wanted to revisit a larger question, because this is something that we've been charged with, is do you think that conceptualizing your research as basic or as applied, somewhere along this continuum, is going to constrain with the mission, the goals of this program, that is to come up with these universals, to come up with these generalizable rules of life? Because if your starting point is something that is going to be an impediment to this goal, I think that's important for the National Science Foundation to understand. I think this is important in general, because you may rethink your question if you're told that, okay, within 5 years, we want to be able to do something with this, as opposed to the old school thinking as, well, I'm just answering basic science, it's not up to me. So Any, Erica, you had your hands up. I don't, feel free to address any of the above.
Yeah, so I think what you're pointing to is a tension in how the terms that we're employing are being framed and what kinds of assumptions are coming along with them. I'm a social scientist. I study the language of science, principally as it's used as scientific tools, not as it's used to communicate with non-experts. When I hear the phrase basic and applied science, I think, what is a problem? I mean, my work has applications to science, but it doesn't necessarily have applications to developing a company, as you're pointing out. I think that starting with the idea of basic and applied science as this question was framed, and just to be super clear, like the question forced us to choose one of these options. We had an option between 1 and 5. And so I think many of us chose an option because we had to, and we would have described our work differently if the question had been framed differently. So I would be really reticent to rest too heavily on the data that's being gathered through this particular survey to understand how each of us thinks about our research in more detail. But in this instance, you know, I had to infer a definition of applied versus basic on the basis of who the question was coming from. This feels like a barrier to doing transdisciplinary research in the first instance, where we already start with many, many different ideas from computer science, from social science, from biology in the room about what an application looks like. So I think that perhaps instead of framing questions in terms of applied and basic, it might be useful to frame questions in terms of what kind of problem are you approaching, and then think about how those problems connect to a wide variety of exigencies and audiences.
Yeah, thanks for making that point. You're right that the question will presuppose a lot of assumptions, so it's important to keep that in mind. And your use of the word transdisciplinary, how do you define transdisciplinary?
So I use the word transdisciplinary because you did, and I think that understanding that trans and interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary mean a lot of different things to different people is more useful than starting off with a definition and then saying, you know, this is a correct or incorrect application of the term, because there is no one single definition at present.
I think language absolutely counts, but I'm worried that going too deep into this maybe this is one of those things that we have to note to sort of go deeper in moving forward, because there's a lot that we have to cover today. So what I'm here, yeah.
Sorry, can I just quickly say something? Sure. Is that when I got involved in this project, when Dan came to me, I didn't think of it as applied or basic. He came to me with an interesting research problem. I'm like, oh, this research problem is interesting. I can learn biology and ecology, and my background in computer science and data science and network science can be helpful here. I never, ever, ever thought of it as like use-inspired research or basic or applied research. It was just not in the cards for me. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe we can hear from both Joe and Sandra, some final thoughts on this, and then we can try to note this and pick it back up as it comes up naturally during the discussions.
Yes, I think I agree with Eric. So really, is this study, this program should be fundamental, because we are looking for theory of rule of life. So it should be very general to apply to all the systems, but they should have some implication for applied research. For example, we are looking for like a species-time relationship. So if we found this relationship, we really can provide some guidelines applied to research for biodiversity protections. So yeah, so it should have applied implications, but not necessarily applied to research.
Sandra, did you want to share that your last thought on that?
Yes, I mean, I learned a lot from just listening to you all. It's fantastic. So for our team, we are also what I would call multidisciplinary. We bring together chemists, a marine biologist, and a microbiome expert. So it's 3 people. And for us, it was developing that proposal. We thought about basic science question. We didn't even know how we would click together as a team. And so to have like the application already in mind, we didn't think about that yet. We just wanted to address fundamentally what chemistry is involved in the symbiosis, in the microbiome, in the marine. And so therefore, we all thought about it as being fundamental questions. But obviously the application, I'm German, so for me, as Stephen was saying, there is an application in targeting ocean warming and losing biodiversity there. So for me, I was kind of thinking it is applied in a degree, but since we are bringing together so different people, which was quite frankly a very exciting but also challenging part of that grant, kind of makes me think it's more basic science. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks for that. So this is clearly one of those rabbit hole kind of issues that could take up a lot of time. And there has been some paper shared or some books shared that you can take a look at if you want to explore this further. But to continue along the discussion, whomever is controlling the slides, can you move to slide 19? Okay, so again, this issue of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, obviously the goal is to bring together people with different sets of knowledge, different expertise, different ways of thinking about some particular scientific issue. And there's a hope for complementarity in multidisciplinary research, but in interdisciplinary, the definitional distinction has to do with integration of ideas, integration of concept, methods, and tools. And that's the National Academy's definition that came out of their 2004 report on facilitating interdisciplinary research. So those of you who write a lot of grants, you know it's important to pay attention to the definitional distinctions when they say we want multidisciplinary, we want interdisciplinary, because they're looking to see the degree to which you are proposing something that can meet that outcome. And what we noticed in looking at the responses, though, is how you people have been able to meet some of these goals when it comes to multi and interdisciplinarity. And one of these fits within this notion of what we refer to as team process, team interaction, interpersonal processes. So essentially, that's the collaborative nature of the research. And what we have seen is a number of you talked about this idea of clicking together. You talked about this idea of being able to start right off with a strong interpersonal relationship. So we'd like to hear from you about your experience in building these interpersonal relationships or building the trust amongst your team in such a way that you could have the necessary open and frank discussions about these challenging problems that you were addressing, and particularly addressing from different scientific perspectives. So any of you want to share some of your experiences with this initial trust building?
Zach, go ahead.
All right. So I came into this project being somebody of the mindset that just to minimize the number of meetings that I have in a day, and if a meeting can be an email, send me an email. But working with this awesome group of people that's part of our project has totally changed my perspective on meetings, and that our group had frequent early meetings where we just hashed out the details of what we're going to do after our excitement that our project got funded. And we worked on a concept paper to try and crystallize these ideas further that I think really, really helped kind of bridge those interdisciplinary differences in language, for example. And then at the end of our first year, we had a project meeting at a collaborators institution down in Gainesville, Florida, where it was part work, part play. And I feel like we emerged from that time as friends and collaborators. That was just awesome. And I think built a great kind of foundation by which, as we get into the more nitty gritty of the project, try and pull stories out from messy data, having that foundation of what I think is true friendship has really helped.
That's great. Do you, so you mentioned this creation of this collaboration or co-creation of a white paper as a mechanism to solidify sort of, the language barriers that might take place between different scientific disciplines. This was actually a theme that we saw from many of you, whether it was encouragement to provide general presentations to non-scientific audiences. We also saw these really beautiful diagrams that these sort of concept figures that Steve refers to as a cognitive artifact, which I thought was a very fun way to term it. So we see a lot of this integration of creating this product ahead of time as a mechanism to solidify the team dynamic and team structure and just get on the same page. Is that, does anybody else want to comment on whether that experience has impacted the way the team operates?
And said another way, how would you all feel if the first thing you were tasked to do was to develop a concept paper that forced the creation of a conceptual framework, this kind of cognitive artifact that some of you shared? And what Jeannie and I were talking about is this is thinking as writing. And we've all had this experience that you don't know what you're thinking until you start to write. And we know from the study of scientific collaboration, you don't know what your colleagues are thinking until they start to write. And successful teams realize this early, or I should say successful interdisciplinary teams. So I'll add that, how would you feel about that being something you have to do, not something you choose to do, if you don't want to comment on your own experience in general?
Erica.
Just very briefly, I love that idea in many respects for the same reasons, but I can say for my own team, we already had a pre-existing relationship prior to this project. And I feel like that is the essential ingredient to making that exercise work.
I think that's noted.
Okay.
Yeah, Holly. Sorry, Steve.
I'll echo the comments.
Okay, go ahead, Holly.
That were made as well, is that our relationship sort of became baked in from the proposal writing stage and continued to grow from there. And we were, I guess, pre-COVID and through COVID. And so we took advantage of multiple meeting times. And we did this sort of exercise that we were just talking about of, we came together in a PI meeting in person pre-COVID before, or just as we were funded, with that goal of putting together a conceptual paper. And we each brought sort of a primer of our particular research foci and our interdisciplinary connections that we proposed at the beginning, and then realized we were not quite ready to write that paper at that time, but that led to a really nice construct to then structure our monthly PI meetings and our monthly all-hand meetings around, so that we could continue that process of saying, what are our conceptual ideas? What data are there? What data are we generating? And then that was further solidified by the team spending time in the field together and merging aspects of the disciplines within the team. So we started, I think I talked about this in one of the other meetings, with like translator scientists who had expertise like both in the empirical and the modeling, so that we could always talk across our subgroups to each other through at least that one person. And then we've tried to facilitate that sort of like continued conversation through open data and protocols. So we've tried to keep everything for the entire project fully open the whole time. And so we have a GitHub repository for the organization and keep everything there. And everybody is a collaborator on those documents and can share to them and edit and create those. And within that, also generate mind maps of how all the different components of the projects are connected together. And I think by staying in that open science, open data space, it really has facilitated the conversations that this is all the opportunity to learn and the opportunity to discuss without feeling any judgment or any particular, way you need to be, and that we can all ask questions because the fields are so different that we need to be able to say, I have no idea what you're talking about. And that's not a stupid question. It's that literally we need to learn each other's languages and be able to move forward. And so I think that really helped us in that particular way. And now, post-COVID, we had our in-person meeting in January, and now we're writing that paper. So I think that's about a 2.5 year break that's gotten us to that point. But the exercise, I 100% agree, the exercise of doing that at the beginning can really be helpful in articulating the ways forward.
Thanks for that.
Before we go to Tina, I just wanted to follow up on Erica's point, but also connect it to what Holly just said. First, with Erica saying that they were successful because they knew each other, they had already worked together. I think that that's true. In fact, there's data about success in science teams based upon prior collaborations, and particularly you're more likely to get a grant if you have already worked together. But I don't want people to think that that's a necessity. There's necessary versus sufficient conditions. And it is a useful exercise. So to connect it with what Holly said is, don't worry if you fail. That is, don't worry if you can't finish that paper. It's about the process, it's about the exercise. The writing is the thinking. And by trying to write, you come to the realization that, oh, we really don't know this issue, or there's a gap here in our understanding that we need to work towards. So that's why it's important. But also to connect to another of Holly's point, there's something we refer to in the study of teams as psychological safety. And that's this concept that you're not worried, fearful of making mistakes. You're not worried, fearful of saying something stupid. It's basically you're comfortable with putting yourself out there. There's a safe environment in which you're not worried to be about being persecuted for errors or pursuing these odd angles of research or ideas. And I think that's going to be relevant to a lot of what you all are doing when you put out an idea that may seem odd or strange. And you can discuss it. You can say, oh, nope, that might not work. Or it may be an out of the mouths of babes phenomena where you've just identified an insight that no one else has thought of. And we see psych safety come up. It's one of the most robust findings in the study of teams out there. And we see it a lot now in the study of scientific teams. Okay. Tina?
So I'll if I can just quickly add, I think another theme that came out of Holly, and I think we're all going to be sort of peppering in and popcorning a conglomeration of all of these things. But Holly mentioned having designated types of meetings. There was like structure and scaffolding to the kinds of meetings that were being expected. So there is also this organizational element that might have been a large contributor to ensuring the smooth running, the actual smooth facilitation of all of these interactions as well. So I'd love to, once we get there, maybe we can also focus on that. So if you can start thinking for comments in a little bit, that would be great. Tina, please go ahead.
Thank you. So one of the things that our team did, and Dan already had this, he had a reading group on network analysis of biological data, and we had some biological data. So when we started analyzing it, it's like, well, why should biological networks be like social networks? And there are a lot of people who, for example, like me, I didn't know a lot about biology or ecology, and Dan gave a great lecture about why, for example, some biological networks are similar to social networks. And the reading group is not just like me or my team presenting our work, it's also like reading what others are doing from statistics, from biology, from ecology. And that was extremely helpful in not only for example, computer scientists and statisticians to introduce ideas from what we're working on, but also learn about biology and ecology and all the problems that kind of data has. And in fact, I believe Dan earlier this year tweeted that we have this reading group and got overwhelmed by how many people around the world wanted to join this reading group that happens every week. And so for us, that was really helpful in both learning about the other disciplines and also generating trust.
If I can ask a quick follow-up question to that, Tina, I'm wondering, it's one thing to say, you talk about this, you talk about this, you talk about this, and then it's another thing to expect that it'll be effective. What kinds of scaffolds or, how did you know who to be the person to be giving this overview of the computer science element, or what structures did you give to the graduate student who was filling in on the biological elements of the project? Like, was this something that just came together because it came together, or was there preparation or coaching involved in putting this together?
Yeah, very good question. I don't think there was a lot of coaching going on. I think it's just the people who were involved in the project. So we had a lot of people who were like, oh yeah, then this paper is interesting. I want to present this paper. And then when they would present the paper, you would have a lot of questions being asked back and forth. And while questions are being asked back and forth, you learn not only about the history and what is happening now. So I just felt like you just need really people who are engaged and want to learn. We had a group of people who just wanted to learn. And it wasn't the case that, for example, only the computer scientists presented computer science papers. So I have a postdoc whose background is in statistical ecology. And so she was presenting papers both in, for example, computer science statistics and also ecology. So, and then as we learned more of the terminology and what they mean, then we were able to broaden who presents what. But that reading group happening every week was fantastic, is fantastic. It was really
So it sounds like an essential component of that is pushing your trainees and members of your lab group to present on things that are outside of their own wheelhouse, get themselves outside of the comfort zone and start thinking about how their partners might be thinking in terms of the project. Yeah. And in particular, if you have somebody on the call who's an expert in that area, then, for example, if a student misunderstood something in the paper, the person can correct them. Yeah. And then that's useful for everybody who's participating in that work. Wonderful. Thank you. Jamie, please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm going to add anything new because I think everything's been that I was going to say has been touched on. But, we were half of our group was previous collaborators on a proposal on a funded grant, and that helped inform how we then baked in the structure to the grant. So I think that was then a big part of what we did, is said, this is what worked in the past. We're going to move forward with that. I think we actually had a great plan, and then COVID, because we submitted pre-COVID. So that changed a lot of the things we were originally going to do as far as cross-mentoring students. But we ended up having to do a lot of that kind of remotely, and probably not nearly as effectively as it would have been if we could have done the travel to each other's labs. But we did manage then ultimately to switch some of the things up as far as who was going to do field experiences and things like that. But yeah, I think baking it into the proposal for us was kind of where we achieved our success, and having those kind of rules up front. So that's all I really had to add to that.
Yeah. No, I think that's important, because if people are looking to do cross-disciplinary meetings, it's good to know that in person, anecdotally at least, has a higher impact than leaning on remote systems. And are you the one who did the postdoc and student exchanges, Jamie?
We had originally planned to do postdoc and student exchanges.
Right. And that's the ones that didn't. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And they didn't happen. Yeah.
So, okay. Because I did have questions on the hows and to what extent that you might. So maybe we could talk about that.
Interestingly, we're at the end of this, right? The whole thing. And we have new postdocs and new students, not on this project, but we're still working at getting them to each other's labs. So I think we kept the spirit of it, but it really messed us up.
Okay, so we'll have to explore that another cycle. But thank you. Joe, you have your hand up.
Yes. Actually, in our project, we did something quite different from others. So most others were more from bottom up. So we know each other, they know each other before, then they have collaboration, then build the proposals, give a response to the call. I think this call is great. So our group was brought like a top down. So when I look at the core at the beginning, so then I was thinking about what kind of fundamental rules, ecology and macroecology we can address. So then I start assemble the team, approach the people whom I don't know. I know them, but they don't know me. So then I approach them. Yeah, actually some like collaborators say, okay, the real doubt is we can get funded because they said they never cooperated with the people who don't know, because I know them, but they don't know me. So really, I think is we are, so our group more like you, like as a mathematician, like a theoretical ecologist. Also, they are the pioneer, also the leader, international leader in this field. So they may plus some like environmental engineers, microecology. So really, say we bring the quite interdisciplinary team together. So as I mentioned last time, we really had difficulty at the beginning. We really understand because they don't know much about microbiology. So we need to, like, they need to learn microbiology. Also, we need to learn some mathematics, some theoretical ecology. So now I think after about 2 years, we get doing very well to get done like together. So I think this program is great. We really is more like a top-down approach. Try to so this program allows us to bring people with different background together, even we don't know, we don't cooperate before.
Thank you. I think it would be really interesting if you're looking at this approach as top down, if there could be a simultaneous bottom up approach that could take place in parallel to, really push it forward. So if anybody has ideas, but Lucas.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch a little bit on a point Dr. Putnam brought up earlier about having this liaison between the two groups and the two PIs. So I'm coming from it from kind of the trainee perspective. I'm part of Dr. Lydia Contreras's lab, who focuses more on RNA biology. But our collaborator, Dr. Tomamis, is well-versed in biophysics and running MD simulations and understanding and analyzing those. So I think one thing that's really great about coming in as a trainee on that project is I get to become that liaison between these two groups and develop a wide breadth of expertise in not only kind of the experimental side of things, but also the in silico work, which I think was also touched on in Dr. Eliassi Rad's point of having a reading group and having experts in the room for these meetings. So I think not only is it powerful for moving the research forward, but from a trainee perspective, it's really important for me as a researcher going into a field that is answering problems that are very cross-disciplinary at this point. It's very insightful to have two experts to draw off of that. So I definitely agree with having kind of those liaisons and offering that up to your trainees to become those liaisons and gain experience in not only the field for your lab, but also your collaborators.
Now, Lucas, I'm going to ask a question that I'm asking every single person, I think, when they tell us about this process that they've been working through and how effective it is. But is there a structure involved that you have either organically identified or sort of went in, as a tool to do this effectively?
Right. So I think in terms of a structure, it was a little bit more organic. So this was a submission pre-COVID. So I came onto this project pre-COVID. So we had to kind of make some changes in the way that we were formatting our meetings. So typically before I came on previous projects, there were in-person meetings that we would have where we would kind of come together and meet one-on-one between the two labs to discuss kind of overall broad arching project development, kind of more in the line of this concept paper that's been brought up. And then more of our weekly or like bi-weekly meetings were virtual. Obviously during the pandemic, we had to move everything to virtual. But I think organically I was brought in as kind of that liaison rather than there being kind of that structured focus. I think moving forward in next cycles and as more trainees are brought into these types of projects, having that as a from the outset of the understanding that like you're having that communication with the trainee of how much they want to be that liaison would be really, really beneficial for the start of that.
Great, thank you. Leonora,
Yeah,
please go
I
ahead.
wanted to.
Oh, sorry, Stephen.
Well, no. Before we get to Lenora, I wanted to follow up on this notion of a liaison. In the study of teams, there's an active area of research, social networks, social network analysis. I've heard some of you mention this. And the concept about what you're speaking is this one of a boundary spanner. So if you imagine people as networks, and if you imagine your different areas of research as a set of social networks, there's going to be some overlap. And what you're describing is that person or the people who are those overlaps. And we know from the study in areas of first in innovation, but now in research and development, these boundary spanners are critical. So there is evidence to support these ideas, but just to follow up on this, another complement to that is who should be the boundary spanner. So on the one hand, you have the boundary spanners who are already straddling two fields, who are already knowledgeable about this. But on the other, what we read and what we were hearing is have the trainees or have the graduate students be trained to be the boundary spanners. I mean, we all know at that age in their life, they're like sponges, they can absorb a lot more. And we've seen just in a number of different complicated research projects, having the graduate students rotate amongst the labs, do this more bottom-up process where they are the ones initiating the collaborations. They're the ones that are learning. They're the ones that are building these bridges across labs can be a very effective tool. Okay, so now Leonora.
Hi, I wanted to jump in on this topic too, because our team, some people knew each other, but mostly had not collaborated and mostly did not know each other very well. Some of us had met briefly at a meeting that had happened the summer before, and others hadn't even met in person before. And we had 4 different co-PIs from 4 different institutions. So it did require a lot of conversations happening over Zoom and a lot of collaboration. And I think to be able to write the proposal, one thing that helped us develop that trust and that feeling of safety and being able to ask questions and be honest and be friendly, but also, critical, was that everyone came to the team wanting to participate, wanting to collaborate, wanting to put in the effort. And we used Google Drive very heavily and those tools. So writing the proposal was really this very active Google document that multiple people were participating in at the same time. And it allowed us to really see that everybody was contributing and pulling their weight. It became this really nice collaborative team. And we also got to be able to ask questions in sort of real time and be able to see how different people were thinking about things and have those conversations. So I think having to start at the beginning, even in the proposal writing, in a very collaborative, but also distant, we were all in different places, allowed us to build that trust and to build that communication. And then now I have a PhD student in my lab who's been part of this project for the past 3 years and has been really integral in being able to interact with different parts of the team and be kind of somebody that brings also the team together. And in addition to our different PIs, our 4 co-PIs at 4 different institutions, we also have a very active international collaborator and then multiple other collaborators who had to run parts of our big experiment. So there was a lot of communication needed.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been able to have this PhD student go and be trained at 2 of the other kind of co-PI collaborator locations as well.
If we have time at the end, I'd love to talk to everybody about, you said, Leonora, the Google Suite was essential for you, but I'd love to hear, was it powerful enough? Everybody seems to be using it. So if you can sort of put some thoughts into your mind of what would be the ideal system for you to effectively work across teams through these digital platforms, what could that look like? So maybe if we have some time at the end, we can raise that. Stephen, did you want to continue or continue taking questions?
Let's see, we're at 1 o'clock. Let's take couple of more. I hear what people have to
Yeah.
say about this.
Yeah. Okay, Erica, please go ahead.
Something that's not been brought up yet in this conversation, I think, yet is power. And just to clarify, one of the
That was
reasons
our
why-
next question.
Okay, well, there we go. I'm a liaison. One of the reasons why I think it was so important for our team to have pre-existing relationships, and it wasn't the whole team, it was part of the team. But it honestly, I think I said that because I am a social scientist. It's frequently the case that other researchers in different fields misunderstand what I do, or sometimes try to put me in a position that doesn't represent what I do appropriately, sometimes try to marginalize me as being the outreach person or the engagement person when what I want to be doing is research. In addition to having the sense of safety, which I agree is really important, I feel like having a sense of the power dynamics in the group and an appreciation for how to acknowledge those and work through them so that someone isn't constantly being put in a position that doesn't allow them to feel safe. I think that, one of the things that might be less tangible and maybe less easily put into a principle is the sense of disposition. I get the sense that we're all interested in being friendly and open and team-oriented. And that's sort of a necessary precondition to enabling that kind of acknowledgement of power.
Yeah, this is a very challenging issue. So we've got power dynamics, we've got hierarchies. The hierarchies exist in a number of different ways. It could be based upon a disciplinary pecking order. It could be based upon academic rank. It could be based upon minority representation, gender, and all of these create fault lines. That is the term used in the study of groups. They create these fault lines that are potential areas of conflict. But what you're talking about is a term, Erica, a phrase I labeled disciplinary disdain. And that's where it's like people may look down on another discipline. And we're actually studying that now in an analogous field in the development of scientific software, where when you bring people from different disciplines together to create a new form of software to advance a particular area of science, you have different roles on those teams. And there are people who feel like they're being ignored by the domain scientists or maybe the software engineers. And that's just analogous to, I think, how social scientists sometimes feel when they work with others. And like you said, sometimes you feel you're being relegated to service. I can certainly empathize with that. I get that a lot as well. And I'm curious, though, first, have you all experienced this? But more importantly, who do you think should address that? How should this be addressed? Is it the role of the PI? Is it the role of the person themselves? Should it be a private conversation? Should it be a public conversation? Because this is a ubiquitous issue. It's something that I think every team is going to experience.
So I can speak to what Erica, did you want to say something? Okay, I can speak to what we did. I think like with the open science, open data, transparency approach, tried to use that as empowerment to break down the hierarchical barriers that are often there in academia, and then set up some structures to try to facilitate that. So our all hands meetings are led by the postdocs, and they then act in the role of the future group leader and saying, who do they need to contact? What kind of conversations do they have? What kind of agendas do they need to set? And then also with the encouragement that everybody has the opportunity to speak and lead at these meetings from the undergraduate level up. And so I think some of that power dynamics will have to come in from the PI team or the group level, because you understand, something about all the people you've started to interact with, and you can understand, in the academic setting, how those dynamics have been developed. It's not always going to fix all of them, especially the larger size your group gets, and finding a way for that feedback mechanism, I think, can be tricky, but we've really tried to just keep everything as open and accessible to everybody. So there's not anything that appears to be a boundary or a hurdle to having any kind of conversation or feeling like it's someone's place or not to make any kind of, statement. And so hopefully that's facilitating an open approach. And then the other reason I had raised my hand before is the other thing that I forgot to say that we do that's helped us to have all these conversations and to bring our team together is that we have an external advisory board. And in that external advisory board, we meet with them once a year. We prepare a report for them once a year, and we get feedback from them. And we've made that a multidisciplinary external advisory board too, so that we have people that are focused in modeling, in open science, in epigenetics, and in molecular ecology, which are our sort of focal areas across that. And that's helped to I think keep us on track from an external perspective, and also recognize where we're articulating clearly or not the things that we're trying to do to move forward, and articulating that externally as well as to each other as team members.
Holly, did you in your setting the tone of having an open data, open transparency, this open culture piece, were you able to come up with a set of expectations that were shared beforehand or as the team was coalescing? Or so everybody sort of was aware of like the norms and expectations. And did that include authorship policies or anything like that?
Yeah, we did both of setting the stage at the beginning of the sort of all hands meeting, and within each institution. I think there are 5 institutions. And then we're revisiting that so that everybody within the team is also contributing to that statement of the expectations of how everything is shared amongst the group. And so it's a living document, which I found very helpful. And the second part of your question, sorry, was
whether you put me on the spot.
Authorship.
Oh, the authorship.
So
yeah.
we've left that to sort of like each group organically. But I think we all knew each other to some extent and have a very open approach. And so one example of that was we have modeling subgroups and mechanistic subgroups, and then we have some definite crossover and collaboration between the two. And we had our all PI postdoc meeting this year, and some people on the empirical side brought up something about the modeling, and then the modeling, even though that was nearly done at that point, they then revamped it because of that and invited the empiricist on. So I think it's been a very it's helped facilitate that open discussion of, because we're always asking each other for data and to explain what this set or this set means, to be able to mesh the models and the empirical data, that has facilitated a very open dialogue about authorship.
And just one last sort of nitty-gritty question. You mentioned a bit of feedback, right? How did you actually know that the undergrads felt comfortable raising their hands and asking the clarifying questions that they needed to sort of work through the material, just as an example group? Like, how did you know that, because it seemed really open and transparent to you in a seat of power, like, was there any kind of formal or informal check and balance to really ensure that the less experienced trainees were able to be heard?
Yeah, I think assessment is always the really difficult part of that. And so I think at this project level, that assessment, that quantitative assessment isn't there, but ways that we've approached it peripheral to this grant is basically anonymous surveys of areas where things can be improved between the hierarchies, to say, what would improve the capacity to feel comfortable asking conversations, or how could we do this thing in a different way? And so that's one tool that we've used, but have not applied in our group. And that's in this particular grant. And that's a very good idea, I think, to not only apply it to my group, but to apply it to this grant, to see if we can get more quantitative assessment, to understand if just because someone's raising their hand, maybe they felt pressure to raise their hand, right, as opposed to comfortable. And I think you could take that data either way. That's a very good point.
Okay. Thank you. Sandra.
Okay, before we get to
sorry.
Before we get to
Yeah.
Sandra, I wanted to follow up on this because I asked the question, who do you think should handle this? And one thing I'd recommend, and if we have time, maybe get some feedback on, is the use of a facilitator, that is someone external to the team. And in the science of team science, we're trying to develop new roles for people on these teams where they take on this science facilitation role, and they're specifically present in key times of a project's development. And you can just imagine at a particular meeting or workshop where folks are getting together. But the facilitation needs to take two complementary parts. There's the interpersonal component that is associated with the power dynamic, but there's also the intellectual component, which has to do with the knowledge integration. And within these roles, what we're talking about is this idea of an integration expert. And there's been some papers that came out recently in some of the journals that publish the science of team science literature, where they're trying to articulate what are the competencies, what are the roles and responsibilities for these kinds of integration experts or science facilitators. And I'm just putting that out there because as we're trying to address these problems, there are alternative means that you can think about. And one way we're trying to develop and train this is with offices of research development. So there's professionals in research development who have backgrounds like you all, but they have taken a different career path, and they're trying to develop the skill sets that could help address some of these problems that you all are experiencing. So the bottom line is, don't only think about an internal solution for this. Try to think about maybe you can go somewhere externally for it. Sandra?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to touch back on, I think just what Stephen was saying. So we also, our main handler of the project was actually a postdoc hired for that purpose. And he was in charge for kind of bringing the three groups together and being really the communicator, which I think was a great role for him to do and set him up now for a really great career. So that was the one question I think Stephen brought up. The other thing I wanted to mention was that the power dynamics, and that sounds maybe odd, especially after Jamie was reporting on the pandemic challenges. For me, personally, I would say the pandemic has actually helped. So we were able to write the proposal during the onset of the pandemic, and it actually allowed us to come together with three people, two senior colleagues in the field, very established folks, my long-term collaborators, Virginia Weiss, in the coral biology field. And so we could pull in another senior person, Mark Martindale, and due to the pandemic, we were actually able to have writing sessions to come up with these cool aims and ideas that me as a chemist could approach them with, and they got excited for it during the pandemic. So almost saying that the pandemic gave these very accomplished people that are on many, many boards and many things, that they suddenly had a little time to get excited for something interdisciplinary and really forged a wonderful full team experience. And we did the same thing. I really can echo Dr. Putman. So we had also team meetings and authorships were discussed with the aims, actually right at the beginning of the project. Obviously that's work in progress and things might change over time, but that was really clearly led early on by this leading postdoc. So pandemic was actually good for us to bring us together in a way that I didn't think was maybe possible.
So Sandra, can we, oh, go ahead, Stephen. Did you want to say something?
No, I was just, I was gonna transition to the education.
Okay, yeah. Let's go for it.
So this is, I think, slide 21. So whomever is controlling the slide deck, you want to bring that one up. Yeah. Now, when it comes to the traditional NSF grant, you know, you've got your outreach, you've got your education and training component, and this is particularly challenging given what you all are trying to address with the rules of life. And we've got some interesting ideas from the surveys that you all sent in, so we want to talk about that a little bit more. So you can see up there, there's the obvious, like, you know, think about participating outside your own field, attending conferences. But we heard some interesting ideas about reading work in other fields, both science and fiction. But there's this more nuts and bolts kind of activity that we'd like to talk a little bit more about. And those are specific kinds of sessions that you all have developed. One interesting one was called the Paper Unwind. Another is about a specific workshop or a course that you've developed. Others are these exchanges with lab visits that's already come up. So we'd like to hear from you all about what you see as particularly successful ways to support what we loosely call education or professional development. And we call it that both because it's not simply about the graduate students, it's also about you all and how you learn while you're working on these projects. And while they incubate, Jeannie, is there anything you want to?
Yeah, I'd love to. So some of the angles that I'm really interested in exploring in this space is not just sort of how did you take the materials that you were building in your work and, you know, make educational materials or train the next person coming up, but also what was the reciprocal event? Is the process of making an output like this or training someone strengthening your science or impacting how you ask your questions? So those are, I would love to see it with reciprocity. But Tina, go ahead. And we can stop sharing slides now, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. Like for me, it's I know how computer scientists solve problems. So talking to a biologist or ecologist or social scientist, it's like, oh, you will solve this problem this way. And so I get to learn, which is why I became a professor anyway, because I like to learn new things. I was the one that put down the paper Unwind as part of my survey back to you. The credit for that goes to the young network scientists. I'm part of the Network Science Institute at Northeastern University in Boston. And they were like, well, when we read a paper, it looks like, oh yeah, we started here, we ended up there. And so we want to actually hear, like, how did you, all the valleys that you went through to get to the paper. And so that has been really, really fun, both for the students and for the authors, and also for everybody involved, you know, across the range of rank. Because we never hear the story behind the paper and how it came about. So
that's very fun. Thank you for that. Ramesh.
I can just share some thoughts about student involvement in training. I mean, our rule of life just started from January, so still figuring out team management and stuff going pretty good. But what we do is, at least in my group, we have teams from three different universities. So all project meetings, I have students attend those meetings. And then, in fact, even take minutes of the meeting and then share those minutes of the meeting with the rest of the team members. In that way, they are forced to capture everybody's thoughts. And that's kind of their, interdisciplinary training also, because now you have ecologists talking and the computer scientists talking, and they're taking all the notes. So that's one way. And then once the project has started, it's been like 4 months now, but maybe like from fall semester, I will start giving them some leadership roles. So, hey, you coordinate this task at least, So in that way, they learn leadership qualities also. And of course, in terms of dissemination, perhaps that's upcoming. That's different things. So yeah, so we focus a lot on student training through hands-on training.
Thank you. For your minute exercise, is there always just a single person doing it, or is this something that rotates across your lab group?
We rotate across lab group. Now, like this semester, one person is doing, but next semester I'll have other student do it. And then we always start with a review paper. Whenever a new project starts, a big one, we always start across the team, start with a review paper, and I have student take the lead. So that also forces them to learn many interdisciplinary and convergent aspect also, because writing a review paper is not easy. You have to be expert in the field. So yeah, initially they think that, oh, it's easy to write a review paper, but then slowly they realize that there's so much of involved. So that becomes a part of the dissertation also.
Thank you.
And those notes are posted, those minutes are posted in Google, share Google Docs. Then other can comment and fill in also. Yeah, that's all I had.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'd love to, oh, okay, Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, so like for student and the postdoc, so we specifically encourage them to organize sessions in professional societies, like ESA or some mathematical society meetings. So as you see, the student, I think one person from UC Davis and the student from University of Florida, they are very successful to propose sessions, get granted. So they will organize sessions and they invite people together to give presentations. I think that's very good for student postdoc to expose to the field, so they get to know each other, also know some senior scientists. I think this could be critical part, especially for postdoc. So for if they're looking for the future for the academic, they're looking for job for the academic field.
Yeah. So the postdoc is going and presenting at a society meeting that's outside their field, or co-presenting with someone. Is that what's happening?
Generally call them to they write proposals to society. So the good idea. So we generally give some ideas. So what's the direction to be? So then they start to invite people. Maybe some they don't know. So we provide some names, suggest whom we should invite. Then the postdoc student to do this, initiate this. Then they organize this. So I think that's very good. Yeah, very good for students. They know the process. They get trained in how to be successful in for communications.
Yeah, communication seems to be a pretty big theme here. Yet I don't know if people are being formally trained in the communication space, either in communication to peers or communication to non-scientists or non-specialists. Yet it seems very important nonetheless. One question
well, did you want to ask a question, or I was going to follow up on that?
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Follow up. Yeah.
Well, to provide some conceptual scaffolding to what this discussion has involved, we refer to it as becoming comfortable with the uncomfortable. And this is something that's crucial to interdisciplinary research. So everyone has a kind of imposter syndrome as they develop in their career, but it's much more manifest in interdisciplinary research. And you need to come up with a kind of scaffolding to help your students become comfortable with unfamiliar areas. And what you all are talking about are these kinds of structures you've put in place that force them to do things that they would not otherwise. And I think these are interesting, these are important, these are good ideas. And in the science esteem science, though, to move that up to a meta level, what we're trying to do is develop an evidentiary base that can be used by people like you. In the meantime, because it's difficult to collect data like this, would you all use, if we came out with like best practices where we codified these kinds of ideas that people have come up with and said, you should do this because it helps communication. It helps your students. It helps you learn how to communicate with people from other disciplines. Is that something that you would be receptive to, or are you just talking about, well, it organically emerged and we did it, but we wouldn't listen to someone, we wouldn't take advice on implementing something we had not come up with? No, you wouldn't do it? Or yes, you would do it? Have any of you heard of the Team Science Field Guide? Okay, I saw one partial nod. So it's those kinds of manuals, so to speak, that are important because, as I said, we're trying to get the data out there to provide this evidentiary base, but in the meantime, it's these kinds of best practices that are being shared. But Emma, did you have something?
Sure. I think to speak really briefly to your question just now, Stephen, I think, some of it is, knowing about these resources is really important, like kind of how do you come across them? And then the degree to which you sort of value them or take them on board is probably also to some extent, determined by the experience that you've had so far, right? And so like if you've had some experience with interdisciplinary work and the recommendations kind of speak to your experiences in some way, then I think it's much more, much more likely that they'll be taken up, as opposed to being like, I'm about to start for the first time doing interdisciplinary work and I'm going to go do all this kind of prior research to figure out how to do it best. I think sometimes it really just helps if those resources are made available as you're struggling through it, and they may help to sort of, put words to the experiences that you're having and provide really kind of useful, practical guidance for moving forward. I had my hand raised briefly to talk a little bit to Jeannie's question about kind of making educational materials, because I think in our group's project right now, we're in the process of collectively developing some teaching materials, and at the moment we're gearing those towards undergraduates. But I think the process of developing these materials has been a very interesting way to have a very interdisciplinary conversation with our group. So it's sort of in some ways the process of or the idea of developing these materials came out of conversations that we've been having about things that we take for granted in our own fields, and then actually trying to build a resource that offers a different perspective, sort of opening up the assumptions that we came to the table with, and then developing teaching materials that help to kind of unpack those assumptions for the kind of audience, for the kinds of students that we might want to be training and having in our research groups. So actually the practice of developing that teaching resource, I think, has been a way for us to have these conversations and to think about, well, what is it that we take for granted? How, what kind of perspective can we use? Can we develop something that helps our students to think about things in a different way? And then we've had actually a graduate student taking the lead on developing that resource and kind of having discussions and bringing people together to focus on different sections and kind of think through collectively what that might look like. So I'd say actually that process of developing the materials for us has been sort of a way to reflect on our interdisciplinarity and then figure out how, how we might kind of bring that perspective to a group of students.
Did you involve undergraduates in the co-development process, or was this co-development among the primary research groups?
We haven't at this point involved undergraduates in developing it. We're still, I think, kind of fleshing out the ideas. I mean, in many ways, it's been a very useful process for the team to work through.
Yes.
And then I think, as we start to have some material available to share, there would be a really interesting process there of conversation that could be had with students, right? To begin to refine that, to refine that, see if it resonates and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then would this be something that like your graduate student can then go and teach at your institution? Like is this a mechanism for trainees to not only gain course development experience, but also the actual teaching experience? And should these kinds of things be baked in to how we might consider the implications for education and or broader impacts?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think this ideally, right, would be something that then once you've developed it, the team would use, and that would be anybody teaching within the team. So grad students and postdocs and PIs and so on. And sort of, I think, and just that practice of developing it is a useful way to start thinking about, okay, well, how do I present material and so on, right? So it's been, yeah, I mean, we're only partway through it, but just the process of doing it, I think, has been a very generative one.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just want to reinforce that point because this was a theme that came across in the responses, and that's thinking about course development, not simply as a means of education across disciplines, but as a way to help you all think more deeply and more broadly about your topic of research. And we've all taught before, we all know the experience of teaching a course for the first time and realizing that you didn't really understand that material. That is, you don't know what you don't know until you try to teach it. And when it comes to interdisciplinary research, an interesting idea is to have as part of the project developing a workshop or developing an interdisciplinary seminar, not simply for the purposes of education, but to force you all to make explicit what you see as the key points, the crucial concepts within your discipline, and then having explicit conversations with your co-PIs about how to explain those and how to integrate those. The goal is helping you become better scientists because it facilitates this idea of interdisciplinarity about knowledge integration. And when we think about understanding the rules of life and thinking about different temporal scales and different scales of understanding or levels of understanding, that those kinds of courses made explicit could help you come up with the research questions, or at least make it more explicit in your mind what are the kinds of questions that need to be pursued once you've thought about what you're going to be teaching the students.
Can I just jump back in really quickly to Jeannie? I think maybe I'm not sure I sort of made this clear at the beginning too, that I'm a social scientist on the team, and the grad student who's leading on this development of a teaching resource is a historian of science. And so we may not necessarily have involved undergraduates, let's say, from the beginning, but actually we've had this quite different perspective of why we're trying to make sense of it. Like, we're sort of the undergrads in this case, right? Of being like, well, what is the information? How is it being presented? And what are some of the complexities here? And, if we think about it from a different vantage point, how does it change the conversation? And so in terms of sort of brokering that process as well, we can bring some expertise to the table, but we can also, to some extent, be the naive students for whom this might be directed.
Sure. And that's really interesting because I think it does bring up a nice segue into considering some societal relationships that were probed a bit in your pre-work questions and the relationships of your work to society. So I think, let me just find my notes on this one. What I took away, and Emma, you were the person who sort of came to mind with a specific example around, you talked about that you came in from a very basic place and that you wanted to map out some of the interesting and productive social dimensions that can be connected with the lab-based work and to pursue them in more depth once they sort of arose, right? And so others maybe had some entry points already that were established and they knew where to go or how to take that work to create those societal impacts. I guess my question here is that it can be really tough to know exactly how this work could impact society downstream, especially when it's pure basic science. And I guess we'll put a pin in the idea that defining things by basic and applied is complicated in and of itself. So when you were exploring those societal relationships or planning to explore those societal relationships, how did you know what you didn't know? And what kinds of scaffolding did you find most helpful to support how you can best connect this work to society or start to connect this work to society? And maybe as an add-on, how important is it to connect this work to society in this moment in time?
Is this question for everybody, Jean, or is for Emma?
I started by talking to Emma, but I think anybody can answer. I don't want to put Emma on the spot.
Okay. Now I can share. I mean, so I do look like our both basic science. For example, my rule of life is about HABs, Benthic community, and there were incidences of a dog dying and person falling sick in Giants National Park. And so if we solve this problem, this has societal benefits, both economical and societal. But then in general, when it comes to, and I do a lot of process engineering, so when we develop technologies which can remove nutrients from surface water or from wastewater, then there are direct societal implications, so which are easy to highlight. But I agree with you that when it comes to very fundamental science, what are the societal benefits? And we struggle. So I would be also very interested in hearing from others and Emma about how do we go about it.
Thanks. Emma, please go ahead.
Sure. I mean, it might be useful just to give a little bit of context here. So the project that the group that I'm part of is working on is really trying to develop kind of basic proof of principles for can we develop kind of genetic circuits in cells that would allow an individual cell to learn. So it's kind of a big picture question. In some ways, not to get back into that conversation, but in some ways, a very basic kind of proof of principle. But but there is sort of an application. I mean, trying to have something learn. And so when I was thinking about possible, you can jump really quickly downstream to big social implications of that. At the moment, I mean, is this setting the foundation maybe for algorithms in cells, right? Could you be developing kind of cellular, algorithms? And then we've had a lot of public attention and media discussion, things like that around algorithmic bias in the tech industry and so on. So to some degree, you could jump straight into that, right? As a possible thing to explore. But at the same time, the work, and so that, I mean, it's an interest that I have. It's some reading that that we can do. We can begin to maybe have those conversations, but actually at the same time, if you're really trying to do kind of interdisciplinary work with a group, you also want to be engaged with the ongoing work of the group. And in this particular project, my ambition was not to kind of constantly be dragging a group 15 or 20 years forward to be speculating about an unknown future, which that is something you could do. It could be quite productive, but at the same time, it felt like this research was still really kind of well, how would we begin to design this and what kinds of architectures could we use and so on. And so, so what felt kind of appropriate at the time to be playing with, if you want to do kind of really interdisciplinary work, how can you find a topic that resonates with the group on the work that they're doing now. And so I think the kind of project that, partly the development of this teaching resources that we've, been thinking a lot in the team about what kind of circuit architectures and so on. So we've actually done a kind of deep dive into, genetic circuits and the history of thinking about genetic circuits and the idea of circuitry as a metaphor and the very different ways in which we represent circuits and so on, as being much more connected to the work that the team is struggling through right now than thinking about, these sort of cellular algorithms that may emerge.
Right.
down the line, right? So it's sort of, you know, I guess it just sort of depends on the expertise that you're coming in with and the kind of work that you want to do and whether there's a really obvious place to start. And in my case too, I didn't know who the graduate student on the project was going to be. And so some of it too is about working with their expertise and saying, okay, what are you interested in and how can we find a way to do something really constructive as a group?
Sounds very, very practical and reasonable. And thank you for not making the jump to the writing cellular algorithms, I think. Although some people might, I wouldn't know. I don't know. Erica, please go ahead.
Yes to everything Emma just said. I mean, my experience has been similar, I think, that rather than studying things that might happen at some point in the future, I'm interested as a social scientist in what's happening now. And that was why I was invited into the project team in the first instance, was because the scientists I'm working with recognized that the language that we have for designing and building with DNA does not work very well with designing and building with RNA. We need different metaphors. We need different ways of approaching what RNA is. And so I see my role as being another researcher on the team who's interested in the same central object, designing an RNA genome, but from a different disciplinary perspective. And to me, that's the most important thing in rather than attempting to anticipate and sort of preclude or prevent potential future risks, building the capacity within research teams now to have nuanced conversations that can extend across disciplinary perspectives about what it is we're doing, and building the not just language capacity, which I think is really important, obviously, as someone who studies language, but also the critical capacity to think broadly about what the systems we're doing can do and how they work, so that rather than sort of trying to build one thing as quickly as possible using the skills you have in your discipline, we're trying to build something that we can understand in more complex ways together. And that requires different disciplinary perspectives, social science and scientists. So I would far rather, frame the role of the social scientist as being a researcher alongside other researchers, rather than being, honestly, I think, like putting us in the position of trying to forecast the future or preclude risks is the best way to ensure that we end up in a service role where we're not making contributions to the team now, but we're sort of siloed in this auxiliary role.
Well, Erica, if it makes you feel any better, I'm an actual outreach professional. So we're absolutely relegated to the service team, even though we do a lot of design and building of scaffolds to make things work well. So I feel you. But thank you for sharing all of that. And I think you've also touched at something Stephen and I had discussed before, and this is the idea of reimagining the roles of who is on the scientific teams, right? And you've already, a couple of people here have already suggested historians, anthropologists, social scientists, and, how do we continue building teams that do bring in these very different positionalities from just a professional standpoint and also probably a personal standpoint to strengthen these teams, but in a way that gives them the equal power and voice. That's, I think, a key piece. Tina, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I think the social implications are extremely important and need to be thought of as first-class citizens, right? So I'm a computer scientist. I work on algorithmic bias, etc. And if you think about the biases and the ethical implications afterwards, it's too late. You're just ethics washing, right? As Emma said. One of the things that I've found it to be very useful is we as scientists actually thinking about, well, how would I present this to a high school student? And I know a lot of us do lots of podcasts for the general public. I have done a lot of work with the Museum of Science, where they bring in community members. One time they brought in lots of high school students. One time they brought in lots of people from industry and academia, so different settings. And for us to actually think about, okay, well, how would I present, whether it's basic or applied research, doesn't really matter, but in English, right? How would I say what I'm doing and get, for example, some young people interested in science, right? And also have the community see the uses of science. So I think putting in some energy there is useful. It's part of the broader impact, right? So the broader impact for NSF is like, why should my grandmother pay for this, right? For this research. And so I find that a very worthy activity, and I put time and effort into it.
And yet, even though you find it a worthy activity and put time and effort into it, is that valued in this project in any in a specific way, or is it valued by your, administration in any specific way? Just want to ask that direct question.
I don't think, like, it's not valued in terms of, oh, look, I had a publication in Nature, right? So a publication in Nature is valued a lot more than you as a scientist spending time going and talking to people like the normal public about this, about the work that you're doing and why is it important. I think in a way, it's in line with like mentoring. A lot of the work that we do as in terms of mentors doesn't really get highlighted as much, right? It's the H indices and the citation counts and so on and so forth. There I can see that perhaps we would need some change in how we evaluate scholars.
Yeah, throwing out there, especially if we're considering these multidisciplinary teams that bring these different perspectives and strategies and positionalities. And then also, if we are identifying science communication or science engagement as mechanisms that help strengthen the capacity for converging research among research members, then I feel like, let's connect the dots a little bit.
So specifically for our project that's funded by this work, we've been talking about having a big biology podcast. And for example, as part of it, we'll talk about topics like the assumptions that scientists make, like why do they make them, right? Or for example, if you know a little bit about social networks, what would that tell you about the fish network or, the zebra network, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So I think those kinds of things we've been talking about it as part of this project, and Dan has been leading it. It's fantastic.
Great, thank you. And I just want to note that Holly has shared a great paper currently in PLOS on the metrics of success. It is something that our team at Rockefeller is covering for our journal club, our university-wide journal club in May, and I think everybody should have a read of it. I think it's a very good paper. So thanks for the shout out. Leonora, please feel free to unmute.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to jump in on this question because as a group that's working on thinking about how microbial and microbiome community function changes across time and space, I think one of the risks with thinking about applied too early is that sometimes, microbiome function is something that's very much in the forefront of what a lot of people are thinking about right now. I think even in the general public, right? There's a lot of companies, there's a lot of startups that are bringing these kind of tools into agriculture, to human health, to conservation. But I think that some of the risks is that because it's still a relatively new science, a lot of times what people are looking at is just a snapshot of a microbiome at one time. Or it's saying, oh, this thing works here, let's just try it everywhere. And I think that those kind of things sometimes disregard biogeography and the fact that you have different species in different locations, and we need to think about these not as something that we can just immediately make universal, or that we should really just be spreading everywhere all at once. And I think the conservation of microbes hasn't really been talked about as much as it probably should be in thinking about that. When you're spreading something that might be a really fast grower everywhere, are you outcompeting now some of the native species there that might be really important in the future? So I think part of what I think about when I think about applied is not jumping too quickly into saying something that works in this one context is something that necessarily should be applied everywhere, but trying to broaden that knowledge and understanding of the fact that things change over time and space, and there may be some general rules, but we shouldn't necessarily jump into monetizing those or making them into applications, even though that my group thinks a lot about how this might apply to agriculture or to conservation, because we are thinking about plant microbiome interactions. even though we're investigating it in a system that is not agricultural or conservation based. So I just wanted to put that out there, as sometimes I think even though things can be applied, maybe it shouldn't be applied too quickly before we really understand some of these basic rules.
Yeah, I think you described one of my favorite sayings in science, and that is science is simultaneously reliable and tentative, right? So how do you predict based on a simultaneous reliability and tentative nature of the work that we do? So tough. Steve, did you want to take a few questions from here?
Yeah, I'm interested in this idea of developing the competencies necessary for these kinds of complex collaborations. So we've been talking about developing competencies for students through particular course development or activities, for example, like communication, and to some degree, identifying the scientific competencies. So said simply, we've got competencies that are collaborative in nature and competencies that are scientific in nature that your teams needs to possess to be successful. The question is, do you think that your teams have the scientific and or collaborative competencies necessary to identify what are the rules of life, whether this be something generalizable across either different fields or different areas, different scales? Or do you think you're not quite there yet, whether it be with regard to how to collaborate across these different fields, or how to, or that the scientific knowledge just isn't there yet? So I don't know if you want to admit on camera that you don't think you're going to be able to identify the rules of life with your grants, but this is a psychologically safe space.
Go ahead, Holly.
I think this is a grand challenge for a reason, right? But I think where we're getting to as a group, and I think as a globally as a field, is understanding more about where rules we think we have fall apart and why. And I think that that's a really important part of what we've been able to do, is say, you know, we have our hypotheses. Where do these hypotheses fall apart? And how does that lead us to the next more fine-tuned hypothesis? Or to step back and say, we're considering too many subtleties about our particular organism of interest, and we need to be considering something in a more global way that has less nuance of, like someone said, biogeography. What did it do in this site at this time, right? Might not actually be helpful to find those global rules. And so I think this is a really useful exercise, no matter the outcome of, can I say this is exactly a rule of life, is I can say I have a greater understanding of the bounds of confidence I have about being able to apply this broadly or not.
Like that framing. Dale?
Yes, I just say I agree with Holly. So it's a big debate in biology and ecology. So whether ecology or biology has a rule, like physics and system dynamics. So because biology and ecology is too complex, so most people said maybe we cannot have general rules like physics and chemistry have. But ecologists try to find some general rules in ecology. So far, I don't think it's maybe general rule. Maybe it's some kind of principles. Like so far, ecologists agreed. So like a species-area relationship. So generally, say as area increases, like species number increases. So this kind of generally accepted principle in ecology. So actually, our project try to address the questions whether is a species time relationship holds. So as time increases, species number increases. So far we look at the different data from different systems. So it seems that it's this rule also holds, but it's quite different from what we see in plants and animal studies. But I don't know why we can say there's a general rule or general or not. But maybe it's general principles, like maybe we can see the patterns. Also, maybe there's some other patterns like transient or stochastic process. So, but maybe. Yeah, it's very hard questions because I know ecologists try to answer the question from many years, but still is very debatable right now.
Okay, let me. I'm going to ask a similar question, but reframe it a bit. In other funding areas that are high risk, this was referred to as a grand challenge, but you can also characterize it as high risk. The funders, for example, DARPA at the Department of Defense, when you write a proposal, they ask that you come up with identify what are the potential impediments to success for your project. And when they ask you to do that, they want to know what are mitigation strategies that you can foresee to overcome those impediments. So we're curious, have you identified, thought about, potentially foresee any impediments to success, any impediments to your actually identifying the rules of life? And if so, could you categorize those as maybe it is the collaboration challenges, maybe it is the training issues, maybe it's technology, or maybe it's the methods. So can you identify and share what might be impediments that you foresee? Erica?
At the risk of sounding like a broken record, one of the things that I know we've discussed in our team and that I hear other folks echoing here is that the framing of the rules of life is maybe something we want to rethink in the first instance. And asking about impediments presumes the framing rather than questioning the framing. One of the things that a postdoc told me on my team that I've held on to and that I love at this point is that she's not interested in searching for the rules of life. She wants to try to find as many different rules by which life can operate as possible. And that was a shift in the framing I really appreciated, because it suggested that biology was perhaps structured differently than physics, and we need to keep searching for all of the different ways it does work, rather than trying to narrow down around a small number of principles that we then presume are the right way to operate.
I love that.
I love that idea. How did your colleagues feel about that? Were they on board, or did they say, oh, that's too philosophical a question?
No, my colleagues loved it too.
Okay. And so you've been able to pursue that with that reframing?
I think that that's what we've been doing.
Okay, nice. Is that?
Yeah, I love this question. So, in our project, we're looking at everything through a microbiology lens, specifically about the succession of microbial function over space and time. And one of the efforts that we're about a year into now is to do a cross-system study of functional succession over space and time to try and bring it outside of the microbial realm. And one major difficulty we're coming into is about all these different types of data that we're dealing with, and the data structure of the data itself and of the associated metadata. And in microbial ecology, we've been talking about this a long time. We're going to have data standards, and the lack of data standards across systems is definitely a challenge that we will overcome, but we're trying to overcome in the moment.
Holly?
Yeah, I think not so much in we've seen it as a challenge, but more in the mitigation of, or the opportunities that this type of study, where many people across different taxa and different approaches are looking for or testing rules of life. I think out of our epigenetics discussion, the capacity for us to come together as groups that have all been thinking really a lot about the rules of life framework, and comparing and contrasting successes and lack of successes in articulating and testing for these would be really valuable to us. And so I think considering a period, where you put a big challenge out there and a lot of people spend a lot of time chewing on it, to then come together as a group and articulate something out of that could be a really valuable exercise.
That's interesting. When you frame it that way, it reminds me of interventions that we've seen, again, in the general study of teams, that's termed reflective practice, where teams move through these action phases and these transition phases, and it's a transition point that a good team will reflect. So have any of you tried to implement a reflective phase where you've moved along in the project, and instead of assuming that you all agree the progress is being made, you step back and say, okay, are we where we expected to be? Are there things that we didn't expect that we need to replan for? Is that something that could help overcome any challenges? And this is for anybody, not just Holly.
I can say really briefly that that's what was our goal for the external advisory board, and having that every year, so that we had a time to really challenge ourselves and say, are we siloed and have blinders on, or is the rest of a representation of the rest of the field thinking in similar ways to us, or can they challenge us in some ways? And then we also had a midterm review that we held of ourselves, just said, where did we want to go? Where have we gone from that? Where have we now changed course for any reason to try to hit our original or new targets of the synthesis of what we learned halfway through? And so I think that's been very helpful for us. I'm sure there are ways that could be more effective and efficient, but it's been helpful for us to pause for those moments and have those discussions.
And were these reviews at all facilitated by a third party, or is this a process that you all just did together informally?
It was informal. It was built into the proposal to begin with, to have an external advisory board, and so and that probably had some bias associated, because it was people we felt could bring something from their particular expertise around the whole project and not just any one area. And so I really like the idea of, I think what Steve was talking about before, the facilitator role for letting everybody be able to present their ideas, but also that integration expertise that's outside the project. And I think that could be a really powerful approach, and merging that with, all the rules of life groups and that facilitator, I think could be really great.
Cool. Joe?
Yes. So Steve, you talked about mitigation strategy. I know I understand this DARPA to this kind of things. So also I have some project with DARPA. They have milestones, they have a mitigation strategy for each part. But in this program may be difficult. For example, even we don't know whether we have the rule of life. So if we don't know this, so then you don't know how to achieve this. So then no matter how do you try, if A don't work, you don't have a B, option B, try to work on this. So I guess that it will be very difficult, very challenging, have a mitigation strategy, try to derive, to get the point, we reach the rule of life. So because we don't know whether we have a rule of life. So yeah, in our project, we don't have any mitigation strategy. We just try different approaches. So to say, try to minimize the artifact or the problems in methods or in analysis. So try to get the best data set. So then try to see what is the generated holds. So yeah, so I don't know what is the mitigation strategy will help in these situations.
Yeah, I'm wondering then if it's a useful exercise for folks to reflect on, what would success look like, or what could success look like at the end of your project, and I like the reframing that was presented earlier about, identifying the many possible places where or how life and rules of life might exist, but moving away from the definitive understanding or identifying rules of life to something that's more tractable based upon what you've been thinking through with your project. And that's more a statement, that's something for you all to think about and share with each other and possibly with the program directors.
So we are going to be taking a break in 14 minutes. So with the remaining 14 minutes prior to the break, I'd love to shift into a briefer discussion on the broader impacts pieces. And as you all know, NSF defines broader impacts as the potential to benefit society and contribute to the achievement of specific desired societal outcomes, such as the incorporation of women and minoritized students into the STEM education and STEM pipelines. And so broader impact activities can have relationships to inclusion, STEM education, public engagement, partnerships, STEM workforce development, societal well-being, national security, economic competitiveness, and also infrastructure. So I guess the question, so with that framing, the question I want to kick off the BI conversation is that we noticed that several of you collaborated with existing science education and outreach networks who already have, pretty established and vetted programming and you did this for your broader impacts works. For example, there are several of you who worked with Girls Who Code. What were the challenges and benefits of working with a community partner, and what would you recommend to others? And how does working with a community partner influence your ideas around science engagement? Thank you, Sandra. Please go ahead.
We at the Whitney Lab have an educational specialist, an outreach specialist, and educational program lead. And so we developed, since we are rather remote, and we were hoping to get a lifelong learning program in the area of microbiome going. And we have done that. We have run it already 1 year now. So it's a little different than the classic K outreach, just the student and smaller kids and developing student outreach. So this is really lifelong learning because we're in Florida. We have a lot of seniors around that are bored in the sun. So we're really excited to have that been developed now. And the feedback was just phenomenal. I mean, I think one number I got is that we have volunteers at the Whitney Lab for all kind of Sea Turtle and other programs. And after our lifelong learning event, we had an increase of requests to volunteer as a scientist here. So I think I really benefited from having, this idea was born with that outreach manager, since she said we have a lot of programs already for students and schools and teachers. What has not been done? And she's been on a workshop for lifelong learning. And she said, that's us. We are in an area where lifelong learning really makes a difference. So it's a little different of a flavor. And I really benefited from that educational outreach expert.
Thank you. And I love this point because broader impacts, I think when people think broader impacts is specifically K through 12 or, judging a science fair, it really narrows you down for what a broader impact can actually mean. And to get into those spaces, and this is just me pontificating for 1 second, it requires an incredible amount of pedagogical knowledge that we're not always trained with. And so it's actually much harder, and it can do more damage by going in unprepared than if you just left it alone in the first place. But thank you for that. Leonora, please go ahead.
I can talk a little bit about a couple of different approaches that my team has used. And one was primarily used by a colleague who isn't here today, but she had been working with the Girls Who Code team at her university. And I think one of the challenges that she was really bringing to our team meetings was that they wanted it to be simplified into really, really simple stories, because the goal was to try and create actual little like games, like online sort of video games that were about the research. And so both having a really clear but engaging story for people who are much younger to be able to get involved in the research, but still being able to have it be educational and informative and relate to our research. So I think that there was a lot going on, a lot of back and forth going on there, where really trying to identify sort of the simple, clear narratives that could be used in a more coding and instructional space for like a very broad audience, right? For girls who code and much younger audience too. And so I can speak only a little to her experience with that from my perspective of interacting with her about it, but that seemed like some of the big challenges that were coming up there. And then, oh yeah.
I was just asked to follow up on that quickly before you move into your next point, but were there obvious sort of areas, at least to you and from your perspective, that, well, geez, if we did it this way, I think this could have improved that experience? Because I do think you're pointing out a very important factor when working with community-based organizations, is that they have their own culture, they have their own mechanism and strategy for engaging with their communities. And just because you have a really cool model, it doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily fit cleanly into the structures that they have for dissemination, right? And so I guess, were there any clear pieces that you could offer to the next round of folks who might be interested in working with a community-based organization, and how to smooth that those conversations out a little bit?
Yeah, I think if I was gonna engage with a Girls Who Code team again in the future for a different project, I think I probably would want to start off by identifying sort of the really broad and general stories that I thought would be most relevant, so that part of the discussion might happen even earlier. And then I think it would help with speeding up that process a bit of moving that project forward. But I think part of it was also COVID, and we started January 2021, so it was part of it was just that I think it was more difficult to communicate things to people through online venues.
Right. Yeah.
And the other project I wanted to talk about is that at my university, we have these vertically integrated projects courses, which are ways that we can involve undergraduates in authentic research, but through kind of a course. So they just take a 1-unit or 2-unit course, but the idea is that they can take it for many semesters. And it's a way to involve undergrads who don't necessarily have the privilege to know that they can cold email professors and ask to volunteer in their labs, or people who don't have the financial stability to be able to volunteer. And my lab also was the first one at my university to team with a community college for our VIP. So our course enrolls sort of half Boise State students and half community college students. And the way that it's structured is that the first semester that students are in it, they go through a series of modules that are relevant for our research. Some are science communication, but it's also like reading scientific papers, starting to code in R, being able to culture a microbe in the lab, being able to run a PCR and a gel. So those kind of modules that are kind of basic skills. And then they get paired up with a researcher, mostly graduate students or postdoc, or sometimes other connected researchers. And then they work directly on a project with them for the following semesters if they continue beyond that first semester. And I feel like it's worked really well as a very cool model of integrated teaching, where we have many different instructors that teach all the different modules. So those students gain a much larger network. They get to know a lot of different people. They get to interact a lot with graduate students and postdocs and people at other stages. It's been really fun to have the community college students be involved. And I think it gives them an opportunity to be involved in research when they might not have had that opportunity otherwise.
Wonderful, thank you. Tina, please go ahead.
Yeah, so 2 things. One is I had similar experiences when I was working with Girls Inc. In particular, I was going to Brooklyn, and there were underprivileged girls there. And really having a good story is important for them to keep their attention. And so, for example, I work on complex networks, so it was easy to like have these networks and these props to show them. And then the other aspect is in my university, we have a program called Align, which is basically teaching folks who weren't in STEM some of the basics of STEM. And one of my personal experiences was I was working with a first-gen student from an underrepresented minority, and she comes one day to my office and says, "Tina, I think I can speak math now." And like, I never thought about math as a language, right? Because for me, like from when I was very early on, I was working and I was like, oh, I guess it is a language. And so, it's both ways, because we learn from them and they learn from us, and it just makes our work even better. And it kind of warms my heart to do this kind of thing, even though, again, it's not so much valued, right? But it's fun.
I mean, if you consider the value immediate or the value to the lab itself in that moment in time, it's hard, right, with undergrads or with other kinds of interns. But like if we think about broader impacts in terms of workforce development, then that contextual shift makes the value go so much higher.
Oh, absolutely.
So, yeah.
When you have like a first gen student who then goes back to her community and says, look, this is for me too, right? Even though I don't see myself in these settings, but look, I can master math and I have a space there. And so it's just really nice. It makes everything worthwhile, really.
Yes, agreed.
Well,
a reminder
it's
of why we
troubling
do
to
this.
hear. I just want to say it's troubling to hear the statement, it's not valued. And, I wish we could change that conversation, because what you just described is so crucial. And it's a problem with academia to hear scientists say that this work of bringing in and cultivating the future generation of scientists is something that's not valued, is problematic. And, anything we can do to change that perspective, we should. And I've heard that kind of statement before, and it still is troubling.
Yeah, I've heard this a lot, and I think what the specific criticism is that the productivity of the work is impacted. However, if you're only talking about research progress, like productivity, but if you're talking about professional development for the trainee who gets to mentor the undergrad, or the ability to write a teaching statement, or some sort of philosophy in an application package through direct experience, that's an added value for the trainee. So it's just weird. It's sort of a evaluation of the types of values that are out there. It seems like the largest, most important value that we can assign to something is how far it takes the research. And then everything else is like, yeah, it is or it isn't, and so it's really, I think it's quite nuanced, actually. It's not black and white. Okay, Holly, please go ahead.
Just want to follow up on your asking about people sort of plugging into existing programs. And we had the capacity to do some of that. Our main field site is in French Polynesia, and we also really wanted to challenge the concept of plugging in just our goals and ideas into a space that has a huge amount of history and culture and place-based knowledge. And so we've been taking the approach to grow and co-develop the education and outreach together with the local community. And there's a really nice work that's been done by Hawaii Sea Grants called Kulana no I'i, which is essentially thinking about place-based science and stewardship within the place, and respect and reciprocity and co-development of the content that's actually in demand and needed by the community, and that there's a long-term focus and not just a short-term focus, and knowledge stewardship shared equally in traditional knowledge and the scientific knowledge that's being generated. And so we've been working with a educational nonprofit there, which takes a lot more time than plugging into existing programs, but I think it's been a really beneficial relationship to work with Reva Atea to talk to the actual local community there and think, beyond the more traditional aspects that are still hugely needed in the US. What can we do that contributes to the place-based knowledge stewardship in the actual locations that we're working?
Yeah, and I think this makes my heart swell because, like I said, I am an outreach professional, and this is like the ideal way to set something up is to co-collaborate, co-design, co-lead these initiatives with the communities that you intend to serve and collaborate with, right? And I love that you are talking about place-based knowledge and just adding on this idea of who holds knowledge and which communities who hold knowledge are being valued for that knowledge. So there is this idea around science, the communication of science, and it's very pervasive. It's deficit thinking, and it's, I am scientist, hear me roar, I have information, you don't have information, and I'm going to fix that gap by giving you all the information that I know, regardless of your context, right? And, or even desire to know these things. And I heard that actually from it's very subtle in a lot of ways that we think. I saw statements like, I overall see the impact of my work in closing the gaps of research education in my space. Yes, but it's also like a yes and / but. Like, what are the things that people want to know, and what place-based knowledge already exists for you to learn from as you develop out those spaces. So thank you. I think, Holly, I love that you're doing that. I think this is exemplary. Joe, I guess we'll take Joe quickly, and then we'll move into our break, and then we'll come back for our reflection. So Joe, you're the last comment for the break.
Okay, I just keep very brief. So in our project, so we have graduate student, undergraduate student to work on this project. So, but this year we especially focus on the high school students. So we work with local high school. So then we bring like a bunch of students in the level 2 to share the laboratory facilities and explain what we are doing in the lab. So the student is get some ideas. Also in the summer, so we get some high school student actually to work on the lab, to do like a DNA extraction, like PCR amplifications, then follow up to sequencing, then do data analysis. So really see the students spend 2 months in the lab. So actually they learned a lot. They really appreciate this. Actually, 2 weeks ago, they came back because they want to go to universities. They come back to the lab. They really appreciate the time in the lab, really help them to think about what they want to do in the future. So some want to do more like statistics or biology. So they really appreciate this, especially stop in the lab to say, appreciate this effort they spend in the lab. I think that's very important maybe for training high school students for the future.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're touching on is, especially if these high school students are being mentored by younger graduate students, for example, this is a near peer mentorship model.
So we generally ask like a graduate student and maybe some postdoc high, teach them to from the fundamentals.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Okay, so NASM team, we're gonna break for 10 minutes. Should we come back at 2:35? Does that sound good for everybody? Okay, so feel free to turn off your videos and sound, and we will be back in just over 10 minutes. we're gonna, the light is at the end of the tunnel, and we're gonna power through the next 25 minutes to essentially tell the NSF your rules of life. Go ahead, tell them all that you know. We can write them down and call it a day. So just kidding. It would be great we want to use this space, Steve and I, prepared a bit of structured discussion, and thank you all for providing, the insights that you were able to share. I think this will definitely help us moving forward, and it's definitely allowed me to discover some key things personally. So that's very cool on another level. But in the meantime, it would be great to give you the floor. What are your reflections on this process, the multiple layers of this process, how this process can be improved? And we'd love to hear from as many of you as possible. If you haven't spoken up to contribute today, and you're running out of time if you do want to share. So we're going to kindly ask that everybody try to think about something to share if they can, and we'd appreciate that. Steve, anything you want to add?
No, I would really like to do the round robin approach because we haven't heard from some of you. So if you all want to take a moment to reflect on what you might want to say, that is to try to identify a particular theme and ideas that stood out for you, you're welcome to. And otherwise, we can treat this like class and start calling on people.
But happy to give some thinking space first. We don't have to jump right into it. So.
And if folks didn't see it while you're thinking, if folks didn't see it, I did share a link to a set of articles on integration expertise that came out last year in a special issue.
The specific question again, yes, I guess that could be very helpful in being able to answer. So what we're really looking for is for you to reflect on this workshop as a whole. Are there specific themes that have jumped out to you as either being something very obvious or something innovative that you want to try, or even something that you're like, wait, I don't think I agree with this. All of those things are on the table. And then if there are any ways that we can consider adjusting the program itself or the process itself, what are some ways that it can be improved? And I think I already know one of them, and that's something that Erica had shared. It's a reframing of how we think about the rules of life might be a little bit more helpful in allowing the researchers to set up the designs to go through their research programs. So that could be one. So yeah, as Steve wrote in the chat, your views on common themes and major takeaways. Thank you, Holly.
So for me, I feel like COVID happened. It happened to everybody, but what it allowed us to do is learn some things that, and figure out some ways forward. But I think what it helped to highlight for our group is the power of the capacity for time series compared to snapshots, because it truncated a lot of what we could do. And I think for really going for rules of life, we really need to understand what are the dynamics versus the rules, or what is the noise versus the signal, and the power of repeat work for time series and understanding natural sort of ambient circadian dynamics versus strong signals is really important. And then for the project itself and the things that we've been talking about within our group and within these meetings, I think one thing that really has struck me throughout, in terms of, we've talked about today, lack of training on pedagogy, or lack of training on mentoring in certain ways, and valuing mentoring at different levels and in different ways, is like, how can we better assess these different things within our practice of each project and each grant, so that we know that we are making room for breaking down hierarchy, we are providing interdisciplinary traineeships without putting too much pressure on one person to have to support, the demands of two different labs or bosses. So how can we better assess the traineeships through our science and through our projects? And one thing that our epigenetics workshop spoke to was the excitement we all felt from talking to each other, I think, in that space, and learning from each other. And if we could all get together across the rules of life, I think there's a lot of potential for us to sort of see where the threads connect or don't across multiple projects. And so maybe something like the Ideas Lab style approach from NSF, where you can put everybody in the room and allow allow the capacity for us to articulate common themes or challenges, I think is really helpful, just as we're doing here in a smaller virtual setting. So I think I've been struck by those particular things. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. I thought that was incredibly insightful. And I think that, one of the ways that we can possibly consider, not that I want to jump into solutions listings, but, I think there is opportunity for us to rethink what research teams look like. And I think many of you have presented diverse examples of research teams. I often say in my community that I wish we had a people manager in the labs, a community manager, someone who is ensuring that the assessments are being distributed and taken, and then also there is action taken based on what those assessments are saying, and things are sort of shifting and fixing and always improving. And the people who are tasked with doing the science are still focused on the science, and the people tasked with making sure the people are all getting together are still focused on the people getting together, and together this work could be really beneficial. And your Ideas Lab reminds me of like the hackathon movement that people often take, where they are these sort of unconference style, like set the agenda as you move forward kind of thing. Those are really fun. They're really exciting, and they require little scaffolding to make happen. So those could be really fun ideas to move these things forward. Thank you.
And
again.
I just want to add that these assessments fit with what I described earlier about developing the evidentiary base for the science of team science. If you all are not familiar with the science of team science, just go ahead and Google that. We're an international collaboration where we're trying to improve these kinds of challenges that you all are facing when it comes to inter and transdisciplinary research. So there are methods, approaches that have been developed. And as I said, we need data, and our subjects are folks like you. So take these assessments seriously. It's not simply for evaluation. It is our science. It is the social science. It's understanding how to improve cognition and collaboration in these kinds of complex teams.
Thank you, Steve. Sandra, please go ahead.
So I was thinking, going back to what I was alluding for before, that I benefited somewhat from the pandemic, that I was able to put two leaders in the field to talk to me and to become really transdisciplinary. And thinking about that more is that was really also facilitated maybe with pre-proposals before. So I feel like having those people that are well established and maybe are the keys for the big solutions in many ways with their experience, get them excited to try something new is really hard. So having like pre-proposal that are unusual, maybe give those people time to develop those new approaches is something that I don't see very often. Many people stick with their common grants they're writing. So the rules of life was something where they were comfortable maybe to reach out and let me as a chemist hop into that very unique combination. So I'm not quite sure how to enable that more, but I feel like that's to give those established people time and the incentive to try something new, to think out of the box is something that I didn't see so often. And the pandemic really helped us. And the other part I wanted to mention again was this trainee exchange. So in our proposal, we had trainees, postdocs, team members being exchanged between the labs. And it turned out we budgeted, I think, 3 exchanges and something. But in the end, so many more students were working on each side of that project. So we had suddenly a postdoc, a grad student, 2 undergrads just in one lab. And so we really needed more exchange opportunities, more travel, more of those meetings. So all the trainees we have budgeted and listed that really bloomed and got much bigger than we thought. And that's something that's always a little bit limited in some of the budgets we are having. But truly everybody benefited from traveling. I hosted 3 students and 2 of my students were away to learn new things and bring this all back together. So just my 5 cents, I think this kind of truly interdisciplinary proposals need to bring people together, but often there's not really an incentive for many people that are well established, maybe getting crazy ideas from some of us here.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's really, well, thank you first for bringing up your exchange program, because when I read about it, I was really impressed by it. And I thought it served as an excellent example for cultivating, as they say, convergent research practices here. And I agree, it is a little difficult to take the well-established who have been very successful with a technique that has brought them, fame and notoriety to say, hey, I'm over here, so I think NSF certainly has the muscle to think about how to change that. Thank you. Joe, please go ahead.
Yes. I think this workshop is very good. So I really learned a lot, especially from my colleagues, how to do science, how to manage this project, so how to train students. So based on our own experiences, I agree with Holly. So right now, I think time series data is very important. So most of you can see, especially for the microbiology studies, most studies focus on snap data sets. So it's not good enough for KG dynamics. So based on this, but so far, you look at the publication data, still time series data not enough. So especially for this project, we took the advantage. So we more like a top-down design. So we know the theory. So then we know how to design the experiment, how to collect the data to address the theory. So we cannot do this for the project because other project more bottom-up project. So I think this is very unique. So then we can just say we have very serious questions and we know how to address it. Also, because to do this, we need like a very interdisciplinary team with different expertise. Communication exchange is difficult, but I think we should, we already overcome these difficulties. So especially with the student help, train student. I think that the workshop very good. So I learned a lot from others how to do this, how to manage this for the future. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's as simple as putting communications training or something into a line item into the budget, and just making sure it's earmarked and people have it, and then you work with networks of people like who know good trainers and connect you to the network of folks who can assist in those spaces. So I think that's a key part, is to remember that those things are important and they need to be paid for with money, Okay, Keith, please go ahead.
Yeah, what I was going to say is directly about what we're just talking about, and that I think we can all appreciate that transdisciplinary research is very important, yet very difficult. And communication is key. We've touched upon that in this conversation. So I think it's really important to have that facilitator, not necessarily the lead PI who's a cutting edge scientist in their field, but a facilitator that's moving between groups. And that's often, if it is in the budget, it's often the first thing to be cut. I think as far as like an action item that could be done on NSF's part is to say that's hard line. That needs to be in your budget. We're unless, and if they don't do it, they're going to keep hearing about this again and again, that these projects are suffering from this. And I think it's one thing that can be learned about taking these multitude of transdisciplinary research. They all suffer from the same issues, and we can try to alleviate some of those with upfront rather than after they happen.
Yeah, thank you for that point. Time is money, and if you have somebody who has expertise facilitating across groups and integrating practices across groups, why are scientists having to get on that wheel and reinvent it, right? So if you want the research to take place faster, then give it the infrastructure to take place faster. Sorry, I'm keep on getting on a soapbox. Tina, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I want to say a couple of things. One is that obviously there's a sample bias here, right? We all are part of a research project that value this kind of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and we chose to be part of it. But I want to just go back to one of the earlier points that was being made. For me, as a professor, as a mentor, as an advisor, it's a lot more difficult to have a PhD in this kind of a research project than if it's just a research project in my field. The reason being, I have to say, okay, well, look, you need to publish in my discipline if you want to get an assistant professor job somewhere, right? And also the pace of publications are also different. So in computer science is like 3 to 6 months versus in like the more traditional sciences, it could be years. And so, that won't work. And so there's some of that I feel like NSF could perhaps incentivize in a certain way. I'm not quite sure how, but that it's in particular, if the publication rates are different, it makes the job for the advisor and the student much more difficult. So then there's the sample bias of who chooses to do this and how can we incentivize for more people to be part of these kinds of research projects. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tina. That is an excellent point. And interdisciplinarity needs to take into consideration both the research inputs as well as the research outputs and the pace at which those things are generated.
Yeah, and if I may just add one more thing, I remember as a young scholar, because I was always interested in this kind of bridging work. And one of my mentors told me, look, you need to have a discipline first, then you could be interdisciplinary, right? And so somebody within academia has to claim you, like you're a computer scientist. Okay, then you could go on. And I'm not sure if we can, change that at all.
Is that true? I don't know. It could be true, but yeah, that's a really good point to consider. Yeah. Lucas, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I've gotten a lot of great takeaways from kind of specifically the communications and the structure that all of y'all have implemented in kind of forming this collaborative team that I think we can definitely improve on here at UT and with our collaborator at A&M, of having more of those structured meetings to define kind of that conceptual white paper. In addition, also kind of upping the number of overarching project meetings. I think in terms of the program, based on some comments from Dr. Contreras and what I've heard today, one thing that would be good is to up the number of during period meetings of funding periods that we have these kind of workshops to talk about current challenges, to talk about things that are working, things that aren't working, because it similar to kind of this idea of like guides to while you're doing things in process, it is really helpful to see how other people are tackling these really big challenges in the field and kind of utilizing this structure. And then even furthermore, there was a conversation in the chat about kind of within the graduate students and the trainees having this conversation about negative data and challenges within our respective fields. I think that's something that would also be really beneficial for kind of the same reason in trying to troubleshoot together and kind of form even more of that kind of cross-disciplinary connection in that instance.
Thanks so much. Leonora, please go ahead.
I feel like my group is still right in the middle of our grant period, so I think we don't have maybe as many conclusions about the project itself, but general takeaways from this meeting today is that I think it's helping me recognize the benefits of being part of a big and varied team. And I think that how those benefits also can affect trainees is really important to think about. And to think about the other side of that, which is when you have sort of a single lab grant, how then do we facilitate these kind of relationships that allow trainees to have more breadth in their mentoring and their skills, and to have the experience of being part of an interdisciplinary team. And I really liked the suggestion of the ideas lab. I think that that could be a really helpful way to, because even one team, I think it's going to be difficult to address sort of like general rules, right? As we talked about earlier, and reframing it, I think is a good idea. But I also think that coming together and having more discussions about the conclusions and kind of what we think about them and how they apply or don't apply, and also thinking about the negative results as well. So I just want to echo that I like those suggestions.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Lucas, for bringing up the point in the chat that we missed to discuss. Sorry about that, Kavita. Zach, please go ahead.
Yeah, great points everybody shared so far. The one thing that I wanted to echo is the importance of information transfer. So just add another voice to the utility of getting the PIs together more. For example, I'm part of this Sustainable Agricultural Systems project also through the USDA. And one of the early PI meetings was just simply people who are in the latter years of their project telling the people in the first years of their project, what went well, what didn't, and just to help that information transfer would be awesome. But also I think to help information transfer with the trainees also, so if there could be some network of PhD students, postdocs, undergrads, and get together and talk about the opportunities and challenges with this unique program. Because I like what was spoken to before about that there's a challenge to being a trainee on something like a Rules of Life project. So I imagine that cohort may have some unique challenges that would benefit from just enhanced connection between them.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you were the one who also mentioned some standardization of the way data is uploaded, and some sort of structure for data deposits. Is that you?
Yeah. It was me.
Okay. Well,
I can echo my own point. I think it was a fantastic point that I made.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good take. I think that's an essential takeaway too. I think there's a lot of these sort of philosophical takeaways, but I think there's a very, to go across this, basic sort of being the philosophical and, the applied part being the tools that we can potentially use to implement in the work itself. So, but I think we are pretty much at time. Steve, is there anything else you would like to share?
No, I just wanted to add that feel free to think of the Sciences Team Science as a resource to help you address these. And I can connect you with either people or publications if you have specific questions. We have an annual conference this summer. It's July in Washington, D.C. But feel free to email me if you have any questions about the collaborative nature of what you all are trying to accomplish.
Yeah. Camila, is there anything else that we should, is there an official sign off?
Hang on. Kavita, do you have anything? She just messaged me. I definitely got my money's worth,
No, this was an absolutely fantastic and extremely interesting discussion, a very nice sort of capstone to the 4 workshops that we've had so far. A lot of really wonderful recommendations and suggestions for next steps and how, what you learned and what can be learned for future efforts, trying to work towards not just understanding rules of life or multiple rules of life, but also working in multidisciplinary teams, an issue that we are constantly dealing with across all of the work that we're doing at the academies. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Take care.
Jill. Thank you, Steve and Jeannie.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.